This presentation is in two parts really. I'm going to give a little bit of context around the Lockdown Library Project, which is a survey of reading habits during the pandemic that we undertook 18 months ago, and then Robbie's going to take over to do some analysis of the data. So you may have seen the story in The Independent and other places. You may not. But this, I suppose the context behind this is that I'm not a corpus linguist. I work in literary linguistics, in cognitive stylistics, and my research is really concerned with ways people read and the way they talk about how they read. As is my colleague Chloe Harrison, and Abby Boucher is a literary scholar who works in genre studies and genre fiction. So the project started really with that in mind. We were interested in how the public's reading habits had changed during the first lockdown during the pandemic, which ran from March to July 2020. We collected data. I'll talk about how we got that data in a bit. And Robbie came into the project a bit later to help out with some of the analysis. But this started really with that sort of question around reading and how has the pandemic changed reading. And I suppose there are a number of sort of issues or contexts that we were particularly interested in as related to what we know about reading and how people read and why they read, and to test those assumptions or those contexts against reading in the pandemic. So the first was that we know that reading is seen as a kind of imaginative escapism, that people read and they talk about their reading in ways that are aligned to sort of escape and creations of new worlds and transportation. Those sorts of metaphors are quite prevalent in the ways that people discuss reading, both academically and sort of lay readers. And we also know that reading has what we call pro-social benefits as well, that reading generally is reckoned to support cognitive and mental well-being, aspects such as empathy, altruism, and also educational benefits and so on. So we're interested to see how those sorts of things might pan out in our survey of readers. The second, I suppose, context was around the situation of reading. Now, obviously, moving online and social distancing and the rest of it that have affected ourselves physically are also likely to have affected the ways in which we engage with literary texts, but also share those engagements with text with others. So we know, for example, that people often read when they're commuting, and that time can be a space where people do engage in that kind of escapist reading from their commutes or their everyday life and so on. And we know, for example, that the kinds of responsibilities that people have at home, such as looking after children or other sorts of caring responsibilities, also impact on the kinds of routines and scheduling of reading. And of course, we were interested in how access or a barrier to access would have impacted on the ways in which people read, and importantly, of course, for this survey, how they report on those experiences of reading. The final, I suppose, context we're interested in has a more historical slant, and that is the idea that there are particular genres that people tend to turn to in times of crisis. So it's recognised that genres that are predictable, repetitive, remind you of reading you may have done as a child, or are connected with a better sort of event in your life. Often people return to those when they are feeling that something is bad is happening. On the other hand, there's some research that shows that actually reading genres that are the opposite, that actually make you feel more anxious, can actually be a way of preparing for uncertainties and anxiety in the real world. That works on a very common idea that reading is a kind of simulation, a safe simulation, in which you can undertake emotional responses in the safety of imaginative fiction and then translate those into real world behaviours. So they're the kind of context that we were interested in. What we did is we generated data via an online questionnaire that was designed and hosted on online surveys, and we distributed that via multiple social media channels. We made use of our institutional website, and we also made use of call for participants as well, that enables the general public to respond to calls such as this. We wanted to capture the responses for the first lockdown only, so that's March to July. So we opened the survey on the 1st of July. We did that because we tried to get some funding but didn't. So that was just after that, and we ran it for 8 weeks, so as to try and capture ideas where they were still fresh in participants' minds. We got just under 900 responses across a number of questions. You can see from the info on the right-hand side there that it was largely younger people who responded, and largely those who identified as female who responded as well. So that was quite interesting. We're not going to really talk about that today, but they were across a number of different employment backgrounds. As you might have expected, those which were sort of employment backgrounds that were connected with reading in some way, such as education or book publishing, tended to dominate, but we did get a fairly wide spread of responses as well. So just a summary of some findings then. These were from the closed questions where participants were asked just to select one option. As you might expect, people did report reading more than normal. There was an increase in reported reading habits. We were interested, the speed question was really designed to think about the ways in which people might have engaged with books in a way that might differ from their everyday practices. So, you know, did they speed through books, or were they more inclined to read them more carefully, and so on. So that didn't really change. And we also, as possibly we didn't expect, saw that most people were still reporting reading physical books. Indeed, there was in some of the open questions, there was a marked sense of people being very close to physical books because that aligned themselves physically with some sense of reading. That was quite an interesting response. People were still responding with others, so we found that there was still a sense of wanting to share reading. Of course, that's what we all do, isn't it? When we read a book, we want to share that experience with others. But obviously, social distancing and the lockdown meant that things like reading groups couldn't take place, so those had to be removed to online fora. And unsurprisingly, those online fora started to appear in frequencies of reported reading with others, even though there was still some face-to-face reading taking place, and we assume that was in terms of family members or close friends or at a distance somewhat. As you might expect, novels were still the genre that were most read, or people reported as most reading, shying away from some of the more perceived difficult genres such as poetry and plays. And we asked again a question around avoidance because we were interested to see if there are particular genres and types of text that were being avoided for any particular reason related to the pandemic. And we found actually it was largely anything that was avoided was to do with preference over genre rather than related to the pandemic as such. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Robbie now, who's going to do a little bit more nuanced analysis of some of our findings.
Yes, so the survey in its original format ran last year without my involvement, and then I joined the project this year when we were discussing how the survey had gathered a lot of open sort of free text responses, and we were talking about how to sort of best try to make sense of those. So I built a little corpus of nearly 7,000 individual responses to a range of questions that we asked. And to explore this data, we ran a keenness analysis in Sketch Engine compared to the fairly newly released, I think, N1010-20 reference corpus, which is, I can't remember how many billions of words it is, but it's absolutely massive. And thought we'd explore some of the salient topics that come out, just some brief examples of the data. So a lot of the responses are fairly short, a couple of sentences at most. Some of the responses are indeed individual words, but there was quite a lot of opportunity for participants to kind of tell their stories of their feelings and experiences, and a lot of the questions were indeed encouraging that sort of discussion. So here are the top 50 keywords, and I've categorized these into sort of thematic groups, and in brackets are the actual rankings of the keywords. And so, you know, some of these perhaps are more expected than others, of course. Some of them are directly in response to questions such as, how are you discussing reading online? And so Goodreads, etc. These websites were coming up. But we thought it was, well, several of these categories are very interesting, but for today, we thought we'd focus on the category that we called purpose, reading purpose, because this was stuff that we were not directly sort of prompting in terms of, do you read for escapism, yes or no, but these are concepts that were offered sort of more organically by the participants, and also get us towards these questions that we were interested in terms of, well, why are people reading more during COVID? What is it about reading? And these themes help us to get towards some answers of that question. Also, the names of the authors that come up as key are quite interesting as well, but that's a story for another day. So escapism, I think, is a really interesting concept. People talk about it a lot when they talk about consuming particularly fictional media, books and films, etc. And some of the sort of collocational patterns sort of told us directly a motion, a travel from one place to another. And the pattern that was dominant, of course, was escaping from the reality of COVID, although interestingly, participants actually very rarely explicitly mentioned COVID or the virus or the pandemic. They did use the word lockdown quite a lot because we were asking them about the lockdown, but they rarely actually explicitly talked about COVID itself. But they would use these sort of more euphemistic or vague expressions such as depressing news, my daily reality, anxiety, etc. Where were they going? Where are they escaping to? Well, basically anywhere out of the real world, any other reality, and this idea of a book I know I will enjoy, as in reading a book again that you've already read because you know you liked the book, is really, really strong in the data. Coordination also gives us a sense of, well, what does escapism actually entail? Familiarity, pleasure, positivity. There's a very strong positive semantic prosody associated with this concept. And particularly it was the fantasy genre that came up as being most heavily associated as a genre with escapism. People talking about how fantasy takes them off into faraway places in their head. So what was interesting, though, is that when you switch from escapism as a noun to escapist as an adjective, what reveals itself is a kind of scale of escapism, if you will. Something being more escapist. We don't find less escapist, but more escapist. I've sought out slightly more escapist narratives, more simplistic escapist reading for me. But interestingly, there's this kind of notion that, I don't normally read escapist literature because it's below me. But during lockdown, I'm going to read escapism. So that sort of we get these temporal phrases. I like anything that's escapist at the moment, but normally I don't because, it's, more simple, as some of the participants say. This quote particularly, while what I've been reading feels escapist, it feels proximate to our lived experience. So there's almost like a qualification of, it's escapist, which is a bad thing, but I'm justifying it because it's still somehow related. So it's almost this idea of escapism as a guilty pleasure. But people are embracing escapism as a way of coping, which I think, all power to them. And then related to, as I mentioned, this idea of rereading, which came up a lot, is the comforting nature of rereading. So a lot of participants reported returning to books they'd already read because it's familiar and comforting. And so familiar and comforting collocate strongly together. Someone even talked about playing Animal Crossing, which is a video game about a farm or something. I've never clearly never played it myself. You grow animals, I think. Grow? I don't know. Anyway, having one of my moments. But they listened to audiobooks while playing the game, which I thought was quite interesting because I don't think I'd concentrate on both. But it's familiar and comforting. So people are sort of choosing, they're less likely to take a risk on something new in case it depresses them or is not what they're looking for. We also get, related to this, comfort with relaxation, distraction, reassurance. Comfort blanket, a nice metaphorical expression, comes up a lot. The idea of reading, particularly rereading, like wrapping yourself in a nice warm blanket. I'm not sure about the person who said they have a master's in Agatha Christie's novels, so it's a comfort blanket. I'm not sure how comforting Agatha Christie normally is, but there you go. And also a comfy blanket or a favourite jumper as well, which is really quite interesting. I'm wearing my favourite jumper today, but maybe I should read a book instead. So, and then of course enjoyment as well. And this is really interesting because we get sort of this idea of guaranteed enjoyment or repeat enjoyment or assured enjoyment. Again, going back to the concept of rereading, I'm picking stuff that I've read before because I know I will enjoy it, because what I need is to be guaranteed before I start reading the book that I'm going to enjoy it. I don't want to take a risk on a new book. Some participants did, as Marcello said, did take the opportunity of more time to actually explore new things, but a lot of the participants were really interested in getting across this idea of going back to old favourites because it's guaranteed to be enjoyable. So to wrap up this brief glimpse at some of our analysis, obviously there were several other categories in the keywords that emerged as well that we can't talk about today. People are reading more, or they certainly were in the first lockdown, perhaps less so now as the measures have eased, but certainly during the first lockdown, people reported reading a lot more than otherwise previously. And this sort of gives us evidence of, some of the motivations for doing so. Clearly, reading for many people is a form of therapy and a way of distracting and moving away into another world. And, I think potentially there are implications in terms of how we may advise people to think of ways of coping in future periods of trauma. I didn't read much during COVID, but I ate a lot. And maybe I wish I'd read instead of eating because it's not as bad for your health. So, I could have done with knowing this before COVID myself. But rereading particularly is actually something that, as I said, came out very, very strongly as sort of good practice because you know what you're going to get. And if you don't mind going back to a story you've already read before, then it's a way of guaranteeing that you'll have a good time. Do you want to add anything to the conclusions, Marcello?
No, just to re-emphasise the point about rereading, that was coming out really strongly. And that's going to be the focus of more work as well, looking at particular ways in which rereading is construed as an agent in particular. So rereading makes or make you do this or make you feel like this. That was very, very strong, the responses. Agency was assigned to reread as a phenomenon.
Yeah, and from a methodological perspective, I mean, for me, this is the first time working with survey data in this way, and actually the interaction between sort of traditional qualitative approaches, looking at the responses with other methods from other members of the team, and then bringing in the corpus as well has been very interesting for me too. So, yes, thank you. Thank you, Robbie, for a great talk. Now we're going to have some questions. And thank you, Marcello. This is, what a day. No, I'm not paid enough. No, I'm joking. Okay, let's take questions in the room. to begin with. Yes.
Thank you, that was really interesting, and I have a question about the methodology, although I'm sure that a lot of interesting stuff could also be done with maybe doing a survey like about Netflix versus reading.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that. You just mentioned the ideas of the methodology of creating a corpus of questionnaire responses. Could you elaborate a bit on the challenges you found? And it looked like you had a very sophisticated coding theme. Was that a lot of manual work, or did Sketch Engine do something of that for you?
No, that's a good question. Thank you. No, that's fairly sort of. It's about the extent of my XML knowledge to be able to create those structures, but actually it was very easy to do because we could download from the survey site each response as a row in a spreadsheet. I basically had a spreadsheet with 7,000 rows and was able to just with a formula put across the structures of those metadata categories as an open class question, closed class question, to create new column with that structure. And then Sketch Engine reads XML, so you can put that straight in and then it will process what is corpus data and what is metadata for you. But it's very basic. I think it's probably Andrew Hardy published a paper a few years ago on sort of what he called, I can't remember if he called it simple XML, but some sort of beginner's guide to it, and it really does sort of take the basics from that. But yeah, Sketch can read that directly, so it didn't involve much manual work at all to get it into that format. But actually, I think the challenge is actually with this stuff, particularly looking at collocation, Sketch at least, and I haven't tried it in other tools, but there seems to be an issue with tools processing collocation across boundaries of responses in this case. So a lot of the collocates that looked to be collocates were not, because these were separate responses, but because they, even though I'd separated them in the XML, it doesn't seem to read the XML as separating responses. We have the same problem in spoken corpora. Yeah. We have the same problem with spoken BNC, for instance. I was talking about that. Because it calculates collocation between speaker turns. So something that at the end of one turn is considered a collocate of something that the speaker at the beginning of the next turn said, even though they're not really collocates because they're from two different authors. And maybe there is, Mike, some advice, we can chat, see what the solution is to that, but it does make, that is the thing that's more challenging rather than actually preparing the data itself. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Elizabeth on Zoom. I don't know the surname, I'm afraid. I just have Elizabeth.
Hi, Robbie.
Oh, it's my colleague Elizabeth. Hello, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really, really interesting, and I think I was one of your very early respondents to that question, actually.
Oh.
But my question is whether you are planning to follow up your findings with another survey to see whether these trends that you've identified are short-lived or more permanent changes to these people's reading habits.
Marcello.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's a really good question. I think the answer to that is yes, we do plan to do something else. What that might be, we're not quite sure, but I would have thought that clearly some habits will not return to what they were pre-pandemic, and that there will be some permanent changes in the sort of way in which we engage with books, but also the ways in which we talk about books and the platforms through which we talk about books, or at least a redressing with the balance between online and face-to-face, as well as, I suppose, engagement with particular genres. And we've seen, certainly in the last year or so, TV programmes, literary texts that have come out that are about the pandemic as well. So possibly looking at replicating something like this, but also combining that with some kind of text analysis, stylistic analysis of books around the pandemic is probably where we're going to go next. Yeah.
Thank you. John Williams.
Hi.
Hi, John.
Thank you very much for that talk. I was one of your respondents, John. I'm probably, I noticed in your question analysis there were 18 instances of the word non-fiction, and I was one of those. And I was wondering why you left non-fiction out of the analysis, because one could easily imagine, we don't have the data for this, but one could easily imagine that there was also a countervailing tendency for people wanting to make sense of what was going on in society in their own minds during the lockdown period, and maybe turn more to non-fiction tests, psychology, politics, etc. For that. So I was just interested in was it simply just bandwidth, you didn't want to leave, you just wanted to do it for fiction, or was there a more principled reason for leaving non-fiction out of it?
Do you want to?
Do you mean not foregrounding it so much in the survey, or in what Robbie was talking about in the analysis?
Marcello, I can't hear you because you're standing too far from the mic.
Sorry, John. What I think you're referring to is in the survey itself. I suppose we all came to this from a sort of literary background, so we were more interested in the literary aspect of it. Although I fully support what you're saying, that there would have been, and there were, including yourself, people who made reference to different domains of knowledge that they were reading up on around science and philosophy and religion, and lots of non-fiction texts actually. But I suppose it just is a question of attention. That's what we wanted to focus on. So there's no other reason apart from that. But again, it would be interesting to come back and look at that in more detail, but also look at at other points in the pandemic or post-pandemic as well.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks for that question. Yes, Helen.
Did you record whether people furloughed in their responses?
No, we didn't. No, I mean people made reference to that sometimes. We didn't ask them, so there was no sort of what's the word, nudge towards that. But people did sometimes talk about that.
Yeah. It's a key word.
Yeah. We brought it up too. The same way also caring came up a lot, both in giving more time and also taking more time away.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And I also realized that my reading, habits changed a lot. But I just wonder, have you investigated and then found out the career background of those readers? Because I found I have to read more because there are too many emails. Everything needed to write, rather than call or speak, or pop into others' office. And then I do find, as a non-native English speaker, my English reading speed, improved. And then, have you investigated about those non-English native speakers, for example, English learners, about their reading, habit? And another thing is that it's a very interesting topic. It's a very interesting phenomenon. But I do feel your results said that they didn't change the reading speed, but my reading speed did improve. So maybe because we have different.
Well, some people did report that their speed. It was just the majority of people said that it was the same, but some people said it had increased and some people said it had decreased. So you're in good company of people whose speed had increased. But in terms of the first question, we were asking about sort of reading practices in recreational time as opposed to people reading because they have more emails, etc. So I don't think we asked them about sort of work-related reading, did we? I don't think so.
No, it's a really interesting potential focus though. But again, it's the parameters of the study really were around literary reading and recreational literary reading. So necessarily those sorts of things we didn't really look at, but I agree it would have been fascinating You sped up, I slowed down. Read a whole book during the whole thing.
Okay, thank you for your questions. Okay, one more, yeah, and then we'll have lunch.
You said you can't conclusively say people are reading more. Do you mean readers are reading more? Because my impression, looking at social media, the variety of orthography you find in many threads and social media suggests that in general people are reading a lot less. The only thing they're reading are other social media posts.
The variety of orthography.
Well, like there, and all those things you find in social media posts where people are moving away from a kind of standardised style.
Oh, right, it's that yeah. I mean, the participants in the study, the majority of the participants, but they are, yeah, of course they are, yeah. So readers are reading more. We didn't study whether public in general, non-readers became readers, for instance, but the people who were reading even more. Good for them. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the way we got participants was just to advertise us on social media. So we basically got whoever came back to us, and necessarily they're bound to be people who are interested in reading and who want to talk about that. So there is that needs to be acknowledged. How sampling was done.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much.